All right. Good morning, evening, or afternoon, or whenever you might be watching this. My name is Professor Ferrero, and welcome back to U.S. History 1877 to the present. So, previous lecture 7.2, we covered the Cold War and American culture. How the ideas of anti communism are influencing the United States, how during the 1950s it led to a lot of conformity, and along with that, a lot of counterculture. Today, we're going to be talking about part of that counterculture in a two-part series about the civil rights movements. And yes, I said movements plural because it's not just the African American civil rights movement we're going to be talking about. We're also going to be talking about other marginalized groups' civil rights movements as well. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and get started on lesson 7.3, the African American civil rights movement. In 7.4, we will focus more in on the other civil rights movements. We won't have time to go in as much detail on them, but we will still cover them. So, a bit of the background for the African American civil rights movement. Going way, way back to the first half of this class, U.S. history up until 1877, or I guess the class before this one, we're going to go all the way back to the end of Reconstruction. I guess that's the very beginning of this class. So during Reconstruction, post-Civil War, things for African Americans are actually relatively good compared to what comes after it, and obviously the slavery that came before it. So during Reconstruction, you had Union troops, Northern troops down in the South, making sure African Americans had their 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment rights protected. At the end of Reconstruction, the Northern troops are going to pull out of the South, and then over the next several decades, you are going to see those rights slowly stripped away in the South, and really throughout the country as well. The KKK is going to die out after Reconstruction. However, it's going to have a resurgence during the Progressive era under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. In the 1910s, if you remember, Woodrow Wilson is going to show off The Birth of a Nation, a KKK propaganda film, to on the White House lawn. You also have the Great Migration as well. So again, it sucks down in the South. There is going to be a series of movements over a 50-year period. It's the 1880s really to 1930s, where African Americans are going to be fleeing the South and going all over the country. Many of them are going to go up north into urban ghettos. That's where you start seeing movements such as the Harlem Renaissance born. That's in the 1920s. You also see a lot of them move out west using the Homestead Act. This is going to be the exodusters that we talked about way back at the beginning of U.S. history, 1877 to the present. Many of them are also going to stay in the South as well, however, deciding to move to more liberal metropolitan areas such as Houston and Atlanta down in the South. And you do have some early civil rights advocates, such as Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. These are the two competing voices, really. Washington's attitude is a very slowed game of let's be so excellent, let's be so amazing that eventually whites have to accept us. Du Bois takes a little bit of a different attitude. He thinks Washington's approach is not really solving any issues. He says civil disobedience and we need to push for equal treatment right now. You also have Ida B. Wells. She is going to be a Southern muckraker, showing off all of the injustices, and particularly in regards to lynchings in the South as well. Du Bois and Wells are also going to be the founders of the NAACP. So that's a very quick and broad overview of everything that happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So you also do have Plessy v. Ferguson, by the way, and we are going to talk about Plessy v. Ferguson in more detail on a future slide. So the U.S. military. The U.S. military is also really important to the civil rights movement as well. If you remember back at the end of our World War II lecture and also our lecture over 7.1, where we talked about the Korean War, Harry Truman is going to pass Executive Orders 9980 and 9981, which are going to desegregate the military and also require that promotions within the military be based off of merit, not be based off of race. So there can't be any racial preferentialism in the U.S. military after this point. The Korean War is going to be the first war in American history that you see integrated regiments since the War of 1812, way back in 1812. However, it isn't actually technically going to be until the Vietnam War where you see full racial integration across the board. This is again going to be in large part due to the success and contributions of Black Americans in World War II, such as the Tuskegee Airmen and the Double V Campaign, which again, go back and watch our videos over World War II if you want to know more about those two. And finally, another big thing pushing all of this forward is the ideas circulating around the Cold War. Remember, the Cold War, America poses itself as freedom and democracy and prosperity under capitalism versus communism, which is authoritarianism, which is no rights, which is no freedom. Well, you have a large chunk of the population, not just African Americans, many minority groups here in the United States going, what about us? You're sitting here saying freedom and equality for all people. They're going to latch on to that language along with the language of the Declaration of Independence, and they're going to start pushing more aggressively for equal rights here in the United States. So that's a pretty good broad overview and recap. Here you have a picture of Truman shaking hands with a African-American soldier after the passage of those two executive orders, 9980 and 9981. This is going to lead us to our first major Supreme Court case, Painter versus Sweatt. So, Painter versus Sweatt is going to be based off of segregation in higher education. It is going to be a partial overturn of Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson, you remember, it's the 1890s case that is going to rule that separate but equal is protected under the Constitution. It's going to state that legal segregation is allowed so long as African Americans and whites, or any people of color and whites, have equal access to facilities, treatment, anything like that. All of this is going to revolve around a gentleman by the name of Herman M. Sweatt. He's an African American law student applying to UT Law, University of Texas's law school. He's going to apply, and the president of UT at the time, Thephilus Painter, is going to argue, you don't need to come to UT. We have a black law school that you can go ahead and go to. Sweatt's going to point out the very, very obvious thing, that law school isn't actually just about the education you get. It's also about the opportunities and the networking that you make at the law school. And because of that, UT is a far better law school, and he's being denied equal treatment and equal access. And this is going to end up before the Supreme Court. The NAACP is going to latch on to this case. They're going to use it to bring it up before the Supreme Court. The NAACP wants to strike down Plessy v. Ferguson, and they are going to have two lawyers on their case, Robert L. Carter and Thurgood Marshall, the latter of which is very, very well known in American history. They're going to take up this case, and ultimately the court is going to rule 9-0 in favor of Sweatt. This is going to be the first judicial blow to Plessy versus Ferguson. So that is going to be Sweatt versus Painter. All right. This is going to bring us to the bigger and more important Supreme Court case of the two. Sweatt v. Painter walked so Brown versus the Board of Education could run. Brown versus the Board of Education is very, very similar to the previous court case. However, as opposed to colleges, it's dealing with grade school. Brown is an African-American man, and his daughter is having to walk very, very far to go to school. He is going to argue that his daughter's not getting the same access to resources as the white kids. The white kids' school is a lot better, and on top of that, it is a lot closer to where he lives. Brown is going to be represented by Thurgood Marshall, the head of the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund at this point. It's a very, very high-profile case. The case actually almost goes the wrong direction. Originally, Chief Justice Fred M. Vinson is going to argue to let Plessy stand. This is a attitude that a lot of Supreme Court justices take. It's called stare decisis. Basically, the attitude is, let's not mess with previous Supreme Court rulings because we want to remain consistent. It's not necessarily a moral argument. It's more of a practical one to kind of direct which way the courts should rule. However, God's hand or something is over this situation because Vinson dies while the case is ongoing. He's going to die before the verdict comes. Because of that, President Eisenhower is able to appoint Earl Warren. Warren is going to be the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he is going to manage to convince the court to rule 9-0 in favor of Brown. The court is going to decide that Brown's daughter's 14th Amendment rights are being violated. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause is the point that they are alleging is being violated here. However, the court doesn't really offer any type of roadmap for how these schools should desegregate. They basically just say, you gotta desegregate. So that's going to lead to instances such as the Little Rock Nine. There is Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall is actually going to be the first ever black Supreme Court justice about 10-ish years after the Brown versus the Board of Education ruling. LBJ is later going to appoint Marshall to the Supreme Court. After his passing, he was later replaced by Clarence Thomas, who is the second African-American man to be on the Supreme Court. And recently, we had the first ever African-American woman on the Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson. Clarence and Jackson are both on the Supreme Court to this day, at least as of recording this 2025. So this is going to lead us, as I just mentioned, to the Little Rock Nine. This is going to be the first major push for racial integration. It's not to say that there weren't there weren't other cases, but this is the first really big high-profile one. It's going to revolve around 9 black high schoolers who are going to attend Little Rock Central High School, a all-white high school. The NAACP is going to push the school board of Little Rock to do this after Brown. Because again, Brown says you have to desegregate. These kids are going to start going to classes, and when the students first arrive, they're actually going to be barred from entering by Arkansas's governor, Orville Flavis, a huge advocate for continued segregation. You might ask yourself, why start in Little Rock, Arkansas? Well, Little Rock, Arkansas is in the deep south. Arkansas at the time was extremely racist, extremely prejudiced, very against racial integration. And so really the NAACP is trying to make an example of Little Rock. Orville Flavis is going to stop these high schoolers from coming to this all-white school, which is kind of crazy to think about. The governor of the state is barring these kids from coming to the school. Eisenhower says, I'm not having any of this. We are going to integrate these schools one way or the other, and he sends in the National Guard of Arkansas to support the integration of the school. Students are going to face a massive backlash from the public and even, again, the government of Arkansas. So here you can see one of the Little Rock Nine being chastised and berated. In the back, you see the guards tasked with guarding them. So, civil disobedience. This is going to lead us into the MLK portion of the African American Civil Rights Movement, the idea of peaceful protest standing in opposition to the segregated South. This is really going to be chartered by Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. He's going to be one of the 2 big thought leaders of the Civil Rights Movement, along with Malcom X. King is going to be predominantly inspired by Gandhi, who did a very similar thing in order to get the British to decolonize in India. He's also going to be inspired by other figures such as Abraham Lincoln, but really his big inspiration for civil disobedience is going to be Gandhi. Both blacks and whites are going to participate in a variety of demonstrations. It's ultimately meant to put the public eye on the evils of Jim Crow and segregation. Most whites around the country really are indifferent to segregation, and that's not to say that they were okay with racism. It's more one of those things as it's out of sight, out of mind. I guarantee you there are horrifying global conflicts happening all around the world right now that you probably don't know about. Not because you're okay with people dying and being slaughtered, but because of the fact that it's just so far away from you, it doesn't affect you and you don't hear about it in your day-to-day. The random little white family in the Midwest who maybe knows 1 or 2 black people in their community and really doesn't deal with segregation on a day-to-day. Sure, if they knew about it, they might care about it, but they really don't think about it. It's not really a present thing in their mind, and they don't realize how bad it is. The Civil Rights Movement, though, is going to push to change that. So let's talk about some instances of civil disobedience. Most well-known one is sit-ins. Predominantly happens at restaurants. It's predominantly college-age students, and they're going to sit in the wrong section. So African Americans are usually going to sit in the white sections. White civil rights advocates might sit alongside them, or they might go sit in the black section as well, just to protest the racial segregation. There's also going to be the Montgomery Bus Boycott. It's all going to kick off because of Rosa Parks. You guys all know the story. Rosa Parks, she had a long day at work. She's tired. A white guy asks her for her seat on the bus, which under Montgomery law at the time she had to do. She refused to do it, and she gets arrested because of it. That story is actually like half true. If anything, the real story makes Rosa Parks even braver, because Rosa Parks isn't just doing this after a long day of work. She's going in to make a point. She's going in to, again, protest the racism of the South. She had originally been put up to it by the NAACP, which, again, if anything, makes her even braver, because she's going out of her way and going into this knowing she's probably going to get arrested. The other big group that is worth mentioning is the Freedom Riders as well. There's a variety of Freedom Rides, but the most famous one consists of 7 African Americans and 6 European Americans who are going to travel around the South, sitting on the wrong sections in the bus. When they get off the bus, they're going to use the wrong restrooms and facilities. I put air quotes around wrong. Ultimately, they're not actually breaking the law by doing this. The U.S. government had stepped in and said any buses traveling between state lines cannot be segregated. So technically, they're not breaking the law. However, they are making a statement, because the buses are predominantly, or not predominantly, they're pretty much exclusively traveling around the South, protesting these racist laws. The riders are going to be attacked multiple times. At one point, their bus is even burned down, and eventually they all get arrested. However, they are later released because, as I just noted, they technically weren't breaking any laws by doing what they were doing. Here you see Rosa Parks sitting on a bus. Obviously, this picture is a recreation. President Barack Obama is actually going to recreate this picture whenever he's elected to president. Here you see an image of a sit-in. Again, you see that it's not just African Americans who are participating in civil disobedience. All of them are college-aged, but you see 2 whites also going ahead and supporting her in her protest. And then finally, the Freedom Riders. So the Freedom Riders, they are going to be a wide variety of ages. They are going to be aged 19 to 61. This little group over here in the bottom left corner is going to be the most famous Freedom Riders. And again, you can really see that it's a wide variety of individuals from a wide variety of ages. They're aged 19 to 61. And you can see up over here, their bus getting burned down. So that's the Freedom Rides. All of this is going to culminate in the March on Washington. So March on Washington 1963 is really kind of the emotional climax of the civil rights movement. This is where MLK is going to give his very, very famous I Have a Dream speech, where he argues for a racially colorblind America, an America that Frederick Douglass had looked forward to, Abraham Lincoln, Thaddeus Stevens, Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, and so many men and women before him were looking forward to. He argues for one where people aren't judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The March on Washington is freaking massive. You can see here in this picture, it is huge. On top of that, too, where he does it is actually really brilliantly placed as well. You can see in the background of this picture the Washington Monument. If you know anything about the layout of Washington, D.C., across from the Washington Monument is the Lincoln Memorial, and that is exactly where MLK is standing to make his point, standing on the shoulders of what Abraham Lincoln had accomplished about 100 years before him. That doesn't mean everything is great after the March on Washington. While it's an emotional high point, and it's really kind of the turning point, the tipping point, at least rhetorically, there is still plenty of racism and segregation still happening in the South. This leads to the Selma marches. I'm going to post footage of it down in the description. It's a series of marches in Selma, from Selma to Montgomery, and protesters are going to be violently attacked. They are protesting the suppression of the black vote in the South. It's going to culminate in Bloody Sunday, and protesters are going to be attacked by law enforcement. They are going to use tear gas, hoses, batons, and they're going to be whacking innocent civilians on the back of horses. These are non-violent protesters. You might ask, why did they never fight back? Well, if they fight back, the narrative very, very quickly changes. If they're non-violent, the headlines are going to be non-violent protesters attacked. It makes people sympathetic to their cause. But if they're fighting back, that's going to twist the narrative of civil rights rioters, right? Attack police. Ultimately, the event is going to be televised, and television is really going to tip Americans' understanding of segregation. Americans are going to see firsthand the evils of Jim Crow and segregation. The event is going to lead to an even larger support of the African American civil rights movement. So that's going to be the Selma marches. Again, it really due to the invention of the television, which we talked about in the previous lecture, the introduction of the television to the average household. Your average American, that white family living in Wisconsin that doesn't know anything about segregation, really sees how terrible it is firsthand, and you're going to start to see even more opposition to it. Here you can see the pictures from the Selma marches. You can see the tear gas and how the cops are wearing gas masks on top of that as well. They have the batons ready in hand. So I think it is also important to talk about Malcom X as well. He is going to be the other side of the coin of the African American civil rights movement. If you know anything about Marvel Comics and the X-Men, fun fact, the X-Men are actually an analogy, an allegory for Malcolm X and MLK. Professor X obviously being Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X is Magneto. Not all the groups in the civil rights movements are going to advocate for nonviolence. X is a black nationalist, and he's going to be a spokesman for the Nation of Islam. He converts to Islam. Later, he goes on a religious pilgrimage to Mecca, which is really going to change how he views a lot of things. While he is not going to advocate for outright, sorry about the noises there, he's not going to advocate for outright violence against whites. He is going to argue for black resistance when necessary. He's not going to say go attack a random white family driving down the road. However, if the random white family driving down the road is trying to run over a black guy, X argues, use self-defense. Use violence when necessary. So he's going to advocate for arming blacks to protect themselves against white oppression, and he is far more militant than his counterpart, MLK. The two are often in disagreement as to how to advocate for the civil rights movement, and I highly, highly encourage you to watch his very, very famous speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. Basically, he's going to say, look, African Americans, we've been trying to vote our way out of this. It hasn't worked. So now we need to decide, are we going to continue to try and do something that hasn't been working, or are we willing to change it up? Are we willing to use violence when necessary? Many pro-African American movements and ideologies are going to come out of Malcolm X's ideas about what it means to be black. Movements such as the Black Power movement and Black Pride can trace their roots back to Malcolm X. Black is beautiful, all of these things. He's ultimately going to be assassinated, though, in 1965, and he's going to inspire many groups to come after him. One of them is going to be the Black Panthers, which are going to mix Malcolm X's ideas with Marxist ideas such as communism and socialism. They themselves are another militant group. It's important to note the legislative action that's happening as well. Not everything's going to get hammered out in the Supreme Courts. You're going to have the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957. This is going to be under Eisenhower. Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy all do a lot. However, the biggest strides are going to take place under Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson's hand is kind of forced. He kind of sees the writing on the wall. Republicans in Congress are going to push for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. Republicans and Northern Democrats are going to push for that. And again, Johnson kind of sees there's no way around this. I may as well just lean into this. So the Civil Rights Act of 57, it is basically going to give power to the Department of Justice to fight disenfranchising of voters down in the South. This is going to be the first ever civil rights law since Reconstruction. Next is going to be the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it is basically going to say any workplace that is getting any type of government funding, you are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. You can't look at a Chinese, Canadian, Buddhist and go, I'm not going to hire you because you're Buddhist, or I'm not going to hire you because you're Asian, or I'm not going to hire you because you're from Canada. You can't discriminate on any of those characteristics. That is going to be followed up by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and it is going to bar any discriminatory practices in voting. Basically, anything that is used to keep specific groups from voting, it is going to target. And that's going to lead us to this picture right here. We have LBJ signing the the Civil Rights Act of 64 with MLK in the background. That is going to complete our very quick and broad overview of the African American Civil Rights Movement. Obviously, there is so much more to it than that. I want to leave you guys with kind of a little bit of a question and a little bit of as I like to at the end of these lectures. However, I'm going to put that at the end of the next video, Civil Rights Movement Part 2, where we cover all of the other groups advocating for their rights during this time period. If you have any questions and you are in one of my classes, please be sure to write them down, bring them to class. I will try to answer them as best as I can. If you are not in one of my classes, please go ahead and leave a comment down below. Be sure to like and subscribe, and have an excellent day, and Ferrero out. Peace.